morning. Hi everyone, and welcome to an Inside the Rookery special edition of our stream celebrating the life and works of illustrator Russ Nicholson. Please do share your own memories and thoughts in the comments, while I'm joined by three luminaries of our industry to talk about their former colleagues, some more recently than others, Dave Morris, Marc Gascoigne and James Wallis. And we hope to be joined soon by Sir Ian Livingstone if he can beat the traffic, but we'll see.
Hello all.
Get down off his golden throne in time, right?
Yeah. Before we get into the chat, can I ask each of you to introduce yourself? Some of you are regular friends of the Rookery and some are newer to the stream than others.
Dave, go first.
Okay. Yes, I'm new. Well, not that new, sadly. I've been doing game books and role-playing games for a very, very long time, and most of that time working with Russ pretty closely, actually. So I think, yeah, I learned early on, and I think Russ himself actually mentioned this many years later, that there are two ways to use him. Like a lot of illustrators, you just say, do me a picture. But I quickly found that it was much better to talk about ideas with Russ. He would come up with loads of inspiration. So really, half of what I've done in my career has really come from Russ's imagination.
Wonderful. I'm Marc Gascoigne, and a long career in the boundaries between role-play games, board games, computer games, and fiction. Currently the publisher of Taconite Books, but I first met Russ sometime in the early mid-'80s when I joined Games Workshop as a plucky young game designer, and also assisted the folks on White Dwarf. Must have been 84, 85. And we'll talk about more about that in a minute.
Yeah, and I'm James Wallis. I'm more recent in the industry than our other three possibly August members, which is to say I joined in the late 80s, early 90s. Didn't meet Russ until 95, or start working with Russ till 95, when Hogshead Publishing, my company, started re-releasing and releasing new material for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, and he was one of our key artists on that, along mostly with Ralph Horsley. Subsequently worked with him on a couple of other projects. Didn't know him socially enormously well, not nearly as well as Dave, for example, but very much enjoyed our interactions when they came.
Well, thank you for joining us tonight. I've got lots of pictures that we're going to be bringing up that have been submitted by the panelists for consideration. Just really bringing back some memories, and even those of us who didn't know Russ himself brought back memories of our earliest forays into role playing in some of these illustrations that Russ did. So he really, I think, when I was looking at these, really embodied an era, the birth of the role-playing industry in this country, maybe?
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, and very much set a tone as well, because his art was, he didn't just draw for one system or one publisher. He drew for Games Workshop an awful lot, but his work also appeared in the Fiend Folio, across the Penguin books as well. So if you were into fantasy, in the interactive fantasy, game fantasy in the 80s, you would see Russ's art. It was there, and it's so distinctive, and there's such a tone to it that you couldn't help be influenced. And in the same way that everyone who saw the Sex Pistols went out and started a band, if you had artistic ideas or ideals, if you saw Russ's art, you would probably be influenced by it. His style, his approach would somehow rub off on you.
Now, Andy Law isn't with us today, but he is unwell, but sends his thoughts too. And Andy has a really good eye and a really good memory for what everything is from. So I'm really hoping that he will be backing me up in the private chat and letting me know if you guys don't know or can't remember quite which source each of these are from. Does anyone know what this one is?
Well, this is Zagor, the Warlock of Firetop Mountain. A picture he's redrawn from various angles, various times. And actually, there's a slightly better version of this that he redid for Jonathan Green's Fighting Fantasy Fest program a couple of years ago. And that tends to be the one that pops up online if you go looking for Russ. It's one of the key images. Russ, I was fascinated to read, because I went looking for a little bit of extra art. I had some in some of the books that he and I worked on together, particularly Titan, his amazing illustrations in that. And I think we've got some of those coming up. But I was fascinated from his own blog, which is currently still extant, and it's a wonderful resource, russnicholson.blogspot.com, where he talked through art throughout his entire career. I started in fanzines, and we didn't know many fantasy illustrators, but when we stumbled across the slightly older extant world of sci-fi fanzines, i.e. short stories and so on, published to small presses, then my own little gaming fanzine, Dragon Lords, stumbled across a whole massive resource of artists. And Russ, it would seem, came out of this, where, Sir Ian, we should all pause, doff caps. Good evening.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Only you, Mark, only you.
I've licked enough of your body before now, Mr. Ian. So Russ, he started as a fanzine guy, and he appeared to have started in superhero comics. And actually, there's an element
girls' comics, I thought.
Girls, in fanzines, he was drawing superheroes, and then he got into girls' comics. He was actually in the Bunty and Mandy
and Misty as well.
Yeah. He studied at Duncan of Jordanstone, which of course is Dundee's art school, and a lot of DC Thompson. So a lot of DC Thompson's body of work is those magazines, Bunty, etc. So that would perhaps explain that link.
Well, in fact, he said he wanted to get into comics right from the start, and so when he was at school, he actually phoned up DC Thompson and said, here are some samples of my stuff. Can I get a job? And they said, oh, you've got to get an art degree. We don't train artists. So he went off, studied. Years later, got his degree, got in touch with them and said, I'm ready. And they said, we don't take people with art degrees. We like to train them ourselves. And so he got into fanzines, and then they got in touch with him and said, we like your stuff. And he thought, it's taken 7 years to crack that particular nut. But yeah.
I'm fascinated to know how, because this is obviously from the first of the Fighting Fantasy game books, but I suspect, Ian, that you came across Russ in the pages of White Dwarf before this point. He was a regular illustrator in the Fiend Factory, I think.
Yeah, he clearly had an amazing style, unique, and really kind of captured the mood of fantasy art at the time, and got to know him and obviously commissioned him for White Dwarf early draws, and then we loved his art so much that when we decided to publish our first 4 board games at Workshop, which were Doctor Who, Valley of Four Winds, Apocalypse, which was formerly Warlord, and Warlock, we used Russ to do all the artwork on all the cards of Warlock. And I don't think not many people remember that, but it was a great game. The 4 games did pretty well, but the art that he did on all the cards were amazing. And of course, we were on to do loads in Fiend Folio, and carrying doing loads in White Dwarf and Fiend Factory, of course. He has a computer, and it was just a pleasure to work with him.
Yeah, one of the absolute key images, I think, for early D&D is the cover of Fiend Folio. We only got another of his monsters there, but the Githyanki, which was one of the first sales by Charles Stross, these days a very successful British SF author, taking a character from a George R. Martin novel and forcing them somewhat crudely into D&D. But Russ's picture gave life to them, that bizarre, twisted, undead thing wrapped in bandages. Bandages and wrapping seemed to be a real thing that he specialized in, whether he was doing something obviously ancient Egyptian, always did amazing mummies and so on, or something just very unworldly. There were layers upon layers upon layers on it, and then redrawn and colored for the front of the Fiend Folio. That's an image. When you talk to Americans about Russ Nicholson, that's what he did. He did D&D pictures. I think in the UK, we know him as much older folks from White Dwarf, a little younger from the Fighting Fantasy game books, and but then of course he also had another act post Fighting Fantasy in the Warhammer, early days of Warhammer and 40k, and then after that in the Wonderful Days, Fabled Lands, and other game books as well, and still drawing even now. I think these days most artists from those eras are remembered with nostalgia, but as we'll see as we flick through, Russ kept learning, kept changing, kept developing, still building on all his strengths and his ability to squeeze 8 million orcs into a particular picture.
Yeah, some of I've moved myself down to the bottom, so the comments will only cover me now. It seemed inappropriate to cover Ian's face every time a comment came up. So
I've got no problem with that at all.
I fixed that. I just want to find so there's the Doctor Who. I get that.
Yeah, that wasn't from the game, but that was a portrait he did later. It shows just how great a penman he was. And actually, Dave mentioned that he got a start in women's romance or girls' romance comics, and again, the style of that. There is a brand new collection on Rebellion just out in the last week or so of some of the classic British 70s romance art, and I suspect there's some of Russ in there. But that very economical line with a little bit of shading, absolutely suggesting all sorts of detail within that, and that's a fabulous picture.
The scarf is brilliant on that. Like it suggests exactly what it is with a real economy of line that he's used there.
And he always used brush for comics. He didn't use pen in the early days. I think later he would use pen, but to get that fine line with brush is really hard.
Yeah. And here's one of a selection. Andy will pop in the comments.
Yeah, that's actually round the wrong way because that's one picture cut in half.
Well, I did wonder that. I was saying to Andy, I did wonder if it was one picture.
It is, and actually Marienburg, the burning city, should be on the other side, but it doesn't massively matter because the cutting in half is actually germane to how he stopped working for Games Workshop. They commissioned a picture, and when he submitted it, they said, actually, it's a bit big for what we've changed the layout to. We'll pay you for the left half. And he went, well, I've done all the work. You'll pay me for all of it, if you please. I don't care what you do with it. And they declined. So he took his picture home with him. Was later rung up by some senior management at Workshop insisting, but they wouldn't pay him for the full picture. So it was a funny company after the wonderful.
That's after Ian left.
Of course, long time after. Yes.
Yeah.
He would have said, "I'll give you 20 quid and you'll like it."
Criticize us. I mean, I think we were guilty of not really understanding the value of the actual art itself, and so much of art got lost, not just Russ's, but.
Well, the reason I mention it because we've all been in places where we've been at odds with folks over the time. I've been sacked by Games Workshop at least once in my time. Not by Mr. Livingston, of course, but occasionally with the same people who are arguing over 20 quid here. But what it actually says is that Russ's attention to detail and, frankly, the sacrifice of his eyesight and intense patience to actually go deep into the detail on this is really what set him apart. There weren't many people who would have gone to such insane lengths to portray an actual pitched battle of tens of thousands of guys. Because in a Warhammer rulebook, this says, this is what's in your head. This is what it could be. You may only be able to afford 20 or 50 or 100 soldiers, but this is really what you're doing. And the team of battle and the burning city and so on is second to none in this.
I don't think I've ever seen this one before. It's astonishing. I wish I had. Back when we were publishing Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, I did get up to go up to Nottingham quite often and leaf through their art archives, and they had copies and, in some cases, originals of lots and lots and lots of this glorious stuff. This wasn't among it.
Because they wouldn't pay him for it. So
so this is the very piece. This is
yes, indeed.
Right.
It obviously meant a lot to Russ because he does tell the story of falling out with Workshop, I think 4 or 5 times across the course of his blog. And he was a bit of a symbol because it was a little bit where I think he was on such an upward slope and trajectory. And then after that, it wasn't quite the same. This was like the close. I know we've kind of jumped around a bit, but this is almost the close of his first stage, his rising star in fantasy roleplay as a whole. And he restricted himself to game books and commissions fairly soon after. I know, Dave, you and he worked together on Dragon.
Yes, Workshop's loss was my gain because then suddenly he was available for any projects I wanted to work on with him.
And presumably for Fighting Fantasy as well.
Well, he was already Mr. Fighting Fantasy. When we came to do Titan, there are several pieces. Perhaps we can flick back to Yastromo's Tower.
Where is Yastromo's Tower? Does anyone know where the original is?
The artwork, no. I'd also like to know, actually.
That one is.
Yeah, that's the one on the right. I drew the original of that with that amount of detail, and Russ then took it and went crazy with it. I'd also like to know, follow on from your comment, Ian, I'd like to know where all my originals went. I guess they went to the artists. But it was a it was a very deep project. It was supposed to have annotations on, but because it was so late in the day, I was late on the manuscript. I'd taken time off work as a game developer at workshop to finish it off. I'd type all day and then lie in bed drawing furiously elf villages and cut through a dwarf citadel and all this stuff because I wanted these amazing extra bits in. I mean, it never quite got its annotations, but it doesn't need it because you can see Yaz sitting in his chair. You can see everything from the aviary down to the alchemical things going on in the basement and the chimneys to get the fumes out and all that sort of stuff. Just crazy level of detail. And Titan as a whole, as a book, probably among the best things I've ever worked on, and I've done an awful lot because everyone went for it in terms of the content, in terms of all the contributors and all their original ideas, and in terms of the artwork more than anything. And Russ was absolutely the pinnacle. But what I was going to say is we had to pick and choose which pictures he did because he was too busy with 3 other game books at the time. And he was like, we can have a couple of guest spots from Russ and a couple of reuses. But then, of course, we got a guest spot like no other, and he went absolutely well beyond the call of duty for this one.
Yeah. I've got a couple of comments to just so I copied that image more times than I care to admit when younger, testing my early penciled inks, desperate to duplicate the extraordinary arcane detail. And here's a really nice comment from Robin. Russ was one of the people whose work in the 80s inspired the interests and friendships that have shaped much of my life. And these 4 guests have played their part in my life in various ways too.
Oh, thank you. Cheers. You've all got one, yeah. Lindsay sent them around.
He also did all the internal artwork of my Adventures of Goldhawk kind of introduction in Fancy Game Books. I don't know if people remember that. And he also
were they coloured, Ian?
Yeah, they were.
He did the colouring as well because there isn't a lot of colour Russ art.
It was
and he always wanted to do colour. I remember he said he would tell me he wanted to do the colour version of Warlock of Firetop Mountain, I think, originally, and also
the cover of Firetop Mountain.
Yeah.
And this map, Dave, I think was for you.
Yes, that was from the Fabled Lands. He also wanted to do the covers of those. I don't know why they. In fact, the weird thing about Fabled Lands was they immediately agreed that we could use Russ for the art, and as I say, I would talk about the idea even before I started writing, so that it's apparently how Dun Sadie used to work with Sidney Seam was they would kind of back and forth, and Russ would have lots of ideas that would get put into the book, but they didn't want Russ for the maps for some reason, and they had their own.
And I remember they didn't want Russ for the covers. I mean, he'd done a rough for Warlock Firetop Mountain, he'd done one for Adventures of Goldhawk, but whilst the publishers loved the intense detail that you could pour over for hours, they didn't think his art was really a selling cover because there was just too much detail. It didn't have a singular character that the eye latched onto the bookshop, like Ian McCaig's art, of course, with the cover of Forest of Doom and Death Trap Dungeon, and like they wanted more of that sort of stuff that drew you in straight into it rather than have to take it in over time what the content was.
Yeah. Well, it looks like we've had a little flick backwards and forwards through the slideshow a little because they're in a slightly random order. And there are 2 types. There are the mass battles and the Astromos Towers, which are those insane eyesight threatening detail fests. But a lot of what stands out from Russ are the single figures. All right, 2 goblins, bloke in a chair. This costs still mad detail. Yes, totally contradict what I'm saying. Why not?
I didn't mean to do that, Mark.
We started with that classic shot of Zagor with the
we did. We'll go back to him.
His head.
There we go.
Yeah. And that's it's plainly a sorcerer, absolutely classic. But the more you look, the more you think, sorry, what is that thing wrapped around his head that appears to be some kind of sucking magical lamprey? Why is his hand black? What's going on with that sorcery? What has he got strings holding up the end of his vestments there? And amazing Arabic shoes on him as well.
Yeah, I'm loving those shoes. But you're right, your eye is just drawn in, and once you're in there, you can't get out of there. You're just drawn all around the piece to look all over it. And let's have a look at these goblins. So 2 goblins, 379. So from Fighting Fantasy?
Unquestionably, yeah.
From Warlock, I think.
Warlock.
From this one, the 82 version. Yeah.
Yeah, I discovered to my horror on asking Ian to sign a copy of it just the other day that the most recent edition has done away with Russ's art, and now I've flipped through it. It's a pale, soulless tome in comparison with the original.
Scholastic, boo. Ian,
Yeah,
of course,
I think they've
representative of
really,
Scholastic at
really
this
missed a
point.
step there. But there's so much character in those goblins. They're not just, oh, they're goblins. It's like, no, you can imagine the tone of the conversation. You can, like, this is the end of a long day. They're bored. There's so much going on in there. Whereas, particularly around the time, and we're talking early 80s here, a lot of the fantasy art that was in certainly the D&D stuff, it was fine. It was very comic booky. And it was kind of about the action, but it wasn't about the characters. It wasn't about the tone. It wasn't about the feel of the place. And that's what Russ really always excelled at, just selling atmosphere. You can smell what that goblin, whatever it is, that, you know, you can almost smell them and their drink, and it's so good.
And the one on the left, there are so many plates. Like, that tells a story in and of itself. Like, this little guy in his chair, he's got all those books. He's got so many plates. There are cobwebs over the plates. And I'm just like, how does he even get up to the top shelf to get his urns down? It's brilliant. Really, really good.
And again, that thing he does with wraps and texture of cloth, there's layer upon layer. It's not someone who's got the fantasy equivalent of a Primark t-shirt on and some trousers. They're all wrapped and extra bits and little bangles and the things hanging everywhere.
Yeah, even on the right hand side, the goblin on the left has a little earring, and you just wonder what was the story behind that. Who pierced that for him? What is that earring? Where did he get it from?
I think that's it. It was story embedded in every picture, and that they came alive. And to enhance your own stories and attempts at stories, as Dave said, he filled in the other half.
Yeah.
Well, he also set the standard and the canon for fighting fantasy, and of course, all the other work that it set the standard for what all the artists had to follow and try and keep in the same sort of canon. So
yeah, that was very important. Fighting fantasy was inspired by D&D and Tolkien and Conan and so on and so forth, but through Russ's art, it really took its own slightly unusual, just left a step to the left, and slowly but surely acquired its own style through Russ.
Russ was very influenced by Jack Vance, and I think you see in a lot of the costumes, there's a Dying Earth kind of vibe going on. I think
so was Gary Gygax. He always cites Dying Earth as his major influence book.
That's not as obvious in D&D, though, I think. I mean,
well, apart from the magic system, but yes.
That's also from Larry Niven's Magic Goes Away, the single-use spells and so on.
Yes. It's mechanically Vancian, but it doesn't feel.
It doesn't feel.
Vance was all about tone, and I think one of the things about fighting fantasy is even buying the first 3 or 4 books, there was a consistency in tone, partly because of the authorship, but also because of the artwork and the presentation that D&D modules at the time didn't have, and you felt this is a consistent world. These are part of, even though at the time they weren't tying together. There was no overarching background to it. You felt there was that consistency there, whereas the D&D stuff were just adventures that happened somewhere, and maybe it was called Greyhawk, but we didn't really care. Fighting Fantasy went there much faster, I think.
All the early D&D books and the first DM's Guide, they just cobbled together whatever art they could get, and some of them, Dave Trampier's Lizard Men, close to Russ's very clean black and white style, Errol Otis being quite psychedelic, almost hippie-ish, but there was lots of stuff which was just, can you draw something quickly? It was, for all that it's very foundational and very seminal these days, D&D didn't have a consistent art style. It was an absolute patchwork of stuff, and some of it, well, stick that picture in because we've got it by this time, and you can see why they seized on. These are from the Fiend Folio, I'm guessing.
Yeah,
they seized on. In fact, we have his internal illo of the Githyanki, which is an update from the sort of scratchier style from the White Dwarf illo of just the character. These are stunning atmospheric pictures. But interestingly, they use a similar style. The Githyanki again is wrapped up with layers and so on and so forth, and lots and lots of wraps around it. I'm less actually impressed by the player characters. That dwarf is particularly puny. The swordsman is a little generic, so I blame D&D for those personally.
Yeah, and Red Trees and Blooms is Russ's illustration of an undead corpse in Firetop Mountain. Paragraph 275 was one of my very first childhood experience of grisly fantasy, and I loved it. That is pretty grisly on the right-hand side.
You turn the page and there's basically a skinned guy, isn't there?
Yeah.
In your children's book. Good work, Stephen Ian.
Yeah. But this one on the right-hand side is pretty disgusting. If that
That's
was
the
your
grail.
first,
I think that's be one of my creatures from
Yeah.
one of the four that we selected for Fiend Factory to go into Fiend Folio.
How did that come together? Who selected those? Was it Uncle Don, or did you all work together, or how did that come together?
The Fiend Folio came about. If you'd read Dice Man, you'd have known all this.
I just looked at the pretty pictures, mate.
It came about is that I suggested the idea to Gary Gygax because of the success of Monster Manual. And they were under the cosh putting out lots of stuff, as you know. And I said, we've got all these monsters from Fiend Factory. Why don't we just publish a compendium? You can fast track it to publishing, and that was always going swimmingly well. And as you know, I'd known Don Turnbull since the late 60s when he was working on his Albion play-by-mail magazine. And I kind of introduced him to D&D and introduced him to Gary Gygax eventually, because we got Don to work from White Dwarf 1 onwards. He became a huge fan of D&D. He introduced the Monster Mark system. I don't know if you remember that, which assesses a monster's difficulty, strengths, and all that. It was so complex, I don't think anyone would have used it at all. But it looked.
People complain about FACO these days, but Monster Mark, I could never get my head around it.
Nobody did, but it filled a page or two.
Well, 3 issues, wasn't it?
It looked really important as a vital contribution to the. Anyway,
differential calculus in D&D, a beginner's guide.
So I asked Don if he was prepared to become editor of the Fiend Folio, and he said yes. And then he started working with the American side of the operation, and everything was going well. And I was working with him to decide the monsters that were going in, and then Albie Fiore was doing the production and also putting in his bit of it. But we put the whole thing together on our side at Workshop. It was all ready to print. And then we had a bit of a falling out with TSR, because it was the time in '79 we'd had this 3-year exclusive distribution agreement for D&D, at the end of which Gygax said, well, why don't we merge these two companies together? And it was going to transpire that the GW bit would represent 1/3 of the combined entity value. But Steve and I, being independent young Brits and not want to spend half our time in Wisconsin, said no to that merger. And so that all got a bit difficult with TSR, especially with the Blooms, rather than Gary, who was a friend. And we said no. And then he sent over his advisor, and we said no to him too. He couldn't believe it. And so then that's when we lost exclusivity to D&D, but remained the largest distributor, because everybody was still coming to Workshop for D&D, plus everything else we had to offer, from Fantasy Games Unlimited to Chaosium to all the D&D supplements, like from Judges Guild and all the figures from Archive and Grenadier, etc. So we were a one-stop shop for all the D&D stuff. So we kind of got bogged down. So that's why it took another 2 years before the actual Fiend Folio came out. And then it was published by TSR. But by that time, Don had flipped completely over to the TSR side, and we kind of got written out of the credits. I don't know if you've ever seen the front page. The editor of magazine asked me to produce this booklet. I mean, we'd done the whole thing, basically. Anyway, that was that. But I think I've got 15 of my own designs in the Fiend Folio.
Here's some more of the layers you were talking about, Marco, in Feathered Friend of the Rookery, Graham Davis's more necromantic abilities. And
Spottilos from GW in terms of the chapter or article title, and then presumably from an advert listing out. So Russ wasn't just doing monsters for the Fiend Folio on a little commission, but could you do as a spot picture or an advert or whatever?
I think that was for the opening of the Birmingham shop, which was number 2 shop.
What do we have here? These are, again, a treasure trove for the eyes.
I picked these. It looks a bit like the goblins. These are 2 sorcerers, but they're so different from each other, except in intent, that we have your classic medieval alchemist with thuribles and skulls and so on and so forth, and a dragon style, or God knows what's on the head of it, more chimera-like head on that, and then a more Eastern-inspired chap with the upside-down pentacle. And these are a couple of years apart from different projects, but you look across the sorcerers he did, he seemed to specialize in them as one of his little sidelines. Amazing on orcs and goblins, amazing on undead and mummies. And then the sorcerers, every single one of them had an entire book hidden in their detail. You could look at them and start going, all right, this is a story prompt here. Who's he and why? Where's that scar come from? Where's that weird crescent moon tattoo on his face below the scar? You can just take these and bring them to life, except he's already done it.
Russ also had a sort of sideline in teaching originally, and in fact one of the artists he taught was Sean Phillips, who works with Ed Brubaker on a lot of projects, and you can see in Sean Phillips' work Russ's influence, I think.
That's because he was at Canterbury, wasn't he, for a time? I don't know if he was teaching there, because there Ian Miller also taught the young John Blanche, so quite a hotbed. And John's art had some flavors of Ian Miller's, and both of them still out there producing amazing stuff. But Ed Brubaker wouldn't be the first, or Sean Phillips wouldn't be the first person you think of. He had sort of hard-boiled crime, often very static pose stuff. But I'm going to have to go back to my copies of Criminal and stuff and have a look at that. I never knew that.
Yeah.
So does anyone know where this one's from? Because this is, I would not have thought of this as a piece of Russ's. I mean, it's gorgeous.
Andy Law will know. He will, like magic, it will appear in my private chat or in the comments, I'm hoping. It's from the GW novels, apparently.
Oh.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
That would be the first range that done with Dave Pringle, the Interzone editor, when Brian Ansell wanted an expert outside team to assemble them. And Dave just rang up all his mates. So you had Ian Watson and John Brunner and Storm Constantine and various people writing.
The aforementioned Charlie Stross as well.
Indeed, yeah. And Dave Garnett and many others. I'm not familiar with the picture, and we did republish a bunch of those. So I'm not sure where that's which book that's from. I must admit.
So Andy, I think, got it. He says Russ posted it himself on his blog. He apologised for the fake runes round the outside. The Orfeo novels.
Ah, yes, they were terrible. They were never republished.
They were not very good.
The Warhammer novels tended not to come back. I think we republished the Conrad books of David Garnett, writing as David Ferring, because he lived in Ferring on Sea on the south coast near Bexhill. But mostly it was things like Ian Watson's Inquisitor and Brian Stableford's books that came back.
Yeah.
But fascinating. Warhammer those days, obviously was a role play setting with a side order of wargame. And it's only over time that the story in the miniatures game grew strong enough to allow for extra novels and stories. It was all Gotrek and Felix and nothing much else in my day. These days, obviously, a very different shape to it with the Age of Sigmar story, and I think they're relaunching Warhammer with more story behind it soon as well.
Yes, apparently Warhammer: The Old World, I think, set a few hundred years before where it was previously.
Yeah,
so it'll be a while until they get around to blowing it up again.
Yeah, it's just before the time of Magnus, isn't it, James? So.
Gotcha.
You know more than I do.
I think that's what it is. Creative Fussy says the use of black and white really complements each other. It's the shadings that bring it all together and make this artwork come to life.
Which is a very perceptive comment, because it is all black and white, but it's that level of stipple and the level of cross hatching. And then when he did black, the blacks were black. Dave, I think you've got some original.
Yes, I was just having a look at as you were saying that, Marco.
The black shines out of those.
It does.
I'm going to solo. Let's do that.
So I'll
just fabulous.
Look at the vapor there that he's got, and the blacks on that one are just amazing. And also another one here, which in the book, of course, you can't see, but it's for the travel chapter of Dragon Warriors, and he's got all the little terrified people in the boat there, and the surface of the water as the creature comes out. It's just amazing.
So just remind us, those are from the original
Dragon Warriors, but of course they're printed at paperback size, so you couldn't see any of that. It's only when he said, "I'm going to send you a couple of the originals," that I thought Wow, should have had an A4 book. Would have looked great.
And Ian, I know you're a big collector of original art as well. Do you have any of Russ's?
Yes, I do. Quite a few, actually. I got all the ones from Dicing with Dragons, because he illustrated Eye of the Dragon, the solo adventure in there. So I have all of those. I mean, you want me to root them out? It might take me 5 minutes.
Well, could have been his one I got out earlier from my bank vault or whatever.
Well,
I've also got the cover of the Fiend Folio as well, but that wasn't by Russ.
No, just adapted.
Yeah. So this looks to be Skaven, which is
yeah. Now I'm pretty sure the one on the left I commissioned for Dying of the Light, which was the first original Warhammer Fantasy roleplay adventure that we published back in 95 or 96, because I think those are the signature characters that we had for it on the right hand side. And then so we said include these characters, which weren't Russ. They were, I can't remember, Tony Ackland, I think possibly did those, and they were fine. And so we showed them to Russ, and then went, and they're being attacked in the cellar by some Skaven, and Russ just went nuts on the Skaven. And you can kind of tell the difference between the bit where he has been tightly briefed and the bit where he's had his head. And it's, you know, in terms of composition, it's not great. But again, there's a whole story in there. There's the person looking down from above, like Ceiling Cat. There's all the different Skaven who are, you know, have personalities all to themselves. Clearly he enjoyed Skaven.
And on the right hand side, there's so many things there that are so archetypically Skaven. You've got the bell with the horned rat symbol on it. You've got the horned rat itself. You've got so much in there that just is iconic, you know, Skaven.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yes.
Very much so. He was never Charles Schultz, was he? 3 lines and a zigzag.
No.
But, I wonder sometimes whether that meant that some people, particularly I guess in the position of commissioning his art, went, well, I suppose we get Russ, but you know, tell him to tone it down a bit. Or could you only put in 720 characters into this 3x5 picture? But I think his approach very much was to fill every inch of space, because he knew it would add to the story, and also the interest. I know there are pictures in some of the Fighting Fantasy books that Russ has done where he's written on all the titles of all the books in the bookcase. And of course, as a kid or a teenager, you are thinking, oh, what's it say? What's it say? Oh, Asimov. Oh, brilliant. It's a joke. It's a joke. And similarly to the caricatures of Steve and Ian and other folks that turn up in the background of some of the pictures. That layer of detail brings you in. It never pushes you away.
Yeah, and I think this is from Andy. I'm a great fan of his Dragon Warriors work. When I was illustrating the 2nd edition and creating maps, reimagining his work was intimidating and also an absolute honor.
He did, actually, he did all those pictures when he was out in Papua New Guinea, because I knew his stuff originally from the fanzine stuff in the 70s, and then I remember when Workshop was doing Warlock and they got the artwork came in, I was in the office and thought, I know that guy. So when I got to do some books, I thought I traced him through a fanzine editor, and they said, you'll have to phone up Papua New Guinea and wait till he's in town or something. And most art directors didn't want to work with him then, because they said, what if it gets lost? But luckily with Dragon Warriors, I was able to get the Corgi art director to agree. And it was great, because I realized then, as I said, I'd brief Russ at a distance, but because we couldn't do daily chats as we did later, a lot would come back, and I think, well, I wasn't expecting that, but I'm going to write it into the story now. So that was, he would do that.
Is there a reason why he was in Papua New Guinea?
Yeah, he was teaching. No, he couldn't. I think he'd lost his teaching job in Britain, and so he went out to Papua New Guinea and he was teaching art there. Fascinating stories, but we won't go into all of those because they'd fill a podcast in themselves.
So what is this from? I'm totally drawn to the heart iconography.
Yeah, this is another one I commissioned. This was from the Hogshead redo of Power Behind the Throne. We did a prequel in our edition, linking it to the previous adventure more tightly. And it was just meant to be a kind of an incidental illustration. It's the knights of a particular order. They are escorting a high-ranking priest. I forget all the details. It's been quite a while, but it was just kind of, it's some knights in a clearing, and they're on horseback, but that doesn't have to be the focus. You talk to most artists, like, don't make me do horses. Horses are hard. Russ gives you 6 horses. Admittedly, he cheats with 2 of them by hiding them behind other horses, but at the same time, the 2 horses you can see, they're not the same. They're completely different angles. The amount of work that's in there and the amount of presence they have, it reminded me, and I remember taking it out of the envelope because this was the late 90s. We were not scanning artwork. We were certainly not sending it over the internet because the internet was dial-up at the time. Knights of the Fiery Heart, thank you. Taking this thing out of the envelope and looking at it and just thinking, this is like an Albrecht Dürer in terms of the presence of the animal, the solidity of the animal within this, the sheer hoarseness of that horse. It's a fantastic piece of work. And then again, in front of them, it's just ground. He did not have to put in that level of detail on the ground, but it was Russ, and he would. And it just had so much. It balances the thing. I love that piece. It's one of the very favourites of all the Warhammer art that I commissioned. I really love that one.
I hadn't seen that one, and I love this. I love the way the 2 horses are looking, just offset and looking at each other, and the heart helmet, the heart shape of the helmet is echoing the heart shape of his thing. It's excellent, just stunning.
I've located the Eye of the Dragon artwork. If anyone
Oh, yeah.
I will pop you on screen solo, Ian.
So this is done 1980, so it's kind of.
Oh my lord!
So this is the adventure that came in Dicing with Dragons, your study of RPGs at the time.
Yeah, that's one. Do you want to see more?
Yes,
oh
please.
yeah.
Again, there is so much going on in that. Most artists, you get the figure and the foreground, and you might get some stuff loosely done in the background, but
everything on every shelf. Detail.
It's like something out of a point-and-click adventure. You want to be able to click on every single one of those items and have a pop-up box on it.
Yeah,
it's brilliant.
Oh, so good.
Saucy Iron Maiden for the kids there, Ian.
I know.
I've loved this picture for so long. Just the sleeping troll or hobgoblin or whatever it is.
Yeah, well, we put it in again in Warlock.
There you go. So characterful.
Yeah. You want some rats?
Yeah. A couple more. These are a couple more Hogshead ones as well. The one on the right is also from Dying of the Light. That's the Attack of the Fimir, which his first version of that was very flat. Because I said it's in mist, and everything was kind of on the same plane. And I wrote back and I went, Russ, this isn't it. Can you bring the figures in the foreground forward a bit more? And he just redid it completely and to produce this. And the one on the left is very dear to me because this again is from our edition of Power Behind the Throne. And this is the illustration of a lot of Warhammer Fantasy role players' barges being sunk. Specifically, it is set light to in the docks, and they can't put it out. And again, this is a 1/4-page illustration. It's not meant to be huge. It's just kind of, setting tone, setting style. And there's so much movement and tone in there. And Russ, when he's not filling stuff with detail, he'll fill it with people as well. He just went so far beyond what the brief was on this. And, what has become, much to my chagrin, a key moment in the history of the Enemy Within campaign, the sinking of the barge.
Well, every single player group ends up with that barge, and every single one of them has been through the same trauma in that picture. What would you expect? And we must say thank you to Ian for getting those out. That was very kind.
Yes. Absolutely.
Yeah, no, lovely to see those.
Yet more 8 million soldiers all in a big pile.
Yeah.
Let's see, what else do we have? It looks like, is that greenskins? No?
That's got to be that's a Warhammer Orc, I think.
Yeah.
Yep. Certainly.
But again, so much going on with the horses as well, so much life in the horses.
And at the time, I think Warhammer, a lot of folks in Warhammer are very influenced by John Blanche and were delivering scratchier and scratchier pictures. John influenced by Ian Miller, but also back to Bosch and Bruegel. Russ was the opposite direction. Everything was crisp and clean.
And here we've got really early 40K.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Space Wombles. Yeah. I don't know enough about 40K to tell anyone about that. I had no idea what's going on.
Ultramarines
But again,
on one side, Chaos on the other. These are two separate pictures. But.
Yeah, they are. Ultramarines, as Marco says, on that side, and yeah.
But again, if I was opening up and you know, a Warhammer rulebook, and this is probably coming out about the same time as Kev O'Neill's fantastic work on Nemesis the Warlock in 2000 AD. It's got that energy, the weirdness, the sheer. This is, I don't know what this is, and I want to know more. I want to find out more about this bizarre armor and these huge weapons and this energy. What's going on? There's no wonder when you look at this stuff that the Warhammer Fantasy 40K in particular was the hit it was, because of stuff like it. You are drawn into the world so much because you've got questions. It's art that just poses questions.
In fact, that reminded me that I would often ask Russ to do something, particularly if it was kind of science fantasy orientated, to come up with something alien. And most artists, they study human musculature, so everything looks like a primate with a cat's head or whatever, but they can't really figure out a different skeleton. But Russ would work from the base and work up. So you could have genuinely alien looking creatures that he would create that looked like they could really be out there in the universe somewhere.
I think, again, that's what brings the character to his work. He's worked it all out.
Yes.
I know various artists I've worked with, and you'll ask them to do a picture and they say, oh, well, that's Captain Uthar Longshanks of the Ultramarines, and he's the 7th this, and he's done this, and he's lost his left arm in battle, and they do build these stories, and it seems to me that Russ was exactly one of those guys. He knew, if he didn't know their names, he knew what they'd had for dinner and when, where these scars had come from. And fascinating to learn that Tim Pollard, ex of Games Workshop, and more recently Nottingham's own Robin Hood, has this on his wall, because I know where he lives. It's not going to be on his wall for long.
Are you going to go and make him an offer, or are you just going to sneak in under the cover of darkness?
Tim is a well-known collector. He's one of the world's biggest fans of Blake 7 and Space 99, and has so much amazing stuff. He's got a keen eye, and he's a great collector of this stuff, and a great archivist of it as well. He doesn't just keep it to himself.
I think in the one on the right, if you look right up in the top right corner, there's just like the suggestion of some people hanging from a beam, and I just think that's brilliant.
Executions as well as
executions,
Chaos Marine madness.
Exactly.
Well, that's what we're fighting for, isn't it? To save any more of our beloved humans from suffering this.
Oh, and here we go. I think another early Mark. I don't know what Mark the Beaky Marines are, but they're the earlier ones, and an early Space Wolf, I think, on the right hand side.
Yeah, and these are again very early. The Rogue Trader rulebook. It's such a fascinating mix of intention and possibility. It's written as an RPG with a game master, despite being a skirmish game. It's focused on human adventurers, but the stuff that everyone wanted, and plainly the stuff that blossomed from it, almost like fruiting mushrooms in a corpse, was all the Space Marine Chaos Orky stuff. The stuff that was front and center was not the stuff that really grabbed people. It was the maniacs in the armor and with the chain swords and the mad Orkies and Chaos stuff. And come first proper edition, the second edition of it, that's exactly where they went. It wasn't until the role-play game that they went back to anything Rogue Trader.
Mm-hmm. And then I think this is our... This is the last one that I've got.
Well, that's the one on the left is one of my favorites, actually, from the Fabled Lands. I think we just said something like it's going to be some undead attacking the ship. And so Russ had, let's have it from what's creepier than... It's like a nightmare. Wake up to that. You're in the captain's cabin, and these things are pressed up against the outside of the hull. And the other one... And look at the grass on that, by the way. This is a scene from the Bloodsword books where you face some kind of revenants or wights that have emerged from a burial mound. And, he really makes them look like something that's come back from the grave. I mean, that's amazing. And the darkness in the sky as well there. Beautiful.
Rotting, decaying, rusting. No straight lines in anything he does. Every line is put with care and subject to sort of decay and entropy.
Yeah, No, I mean, it's the difference between, particularly the one on the right, between that and what you were getting in American fantasy and still are, where it's kind of, you point at it and you go, I know what that is. That's a Fluggenham. And it's in page 72 of something like that. You look at the stuff on, one of Russ's and you go, what the hell is that? Are we going to have to fight it? Because I'm not sure we're going to win. And I was having a conversation recently about the difference in tone between British and American fantasy, particularly in the 80s and 90s. And a lot of it, I think, comes down to that kind of tone. That's for the British stuff, it's unknown and it's scary. And there's there's an oddness to it, not necessarily a darkness, but a personality as well. And, I think that's really where Russ's strengths lay.
I think both of them show the demands of a game book illustration as well, which is that you're the player and this is what you see. So whereas you can do a battle scene with 20,000 orcs and space marines or whatever, but this is, you turn the page and in section 312 mad things are scratching at the window trying to get at you, or out of the mist loom 5 figures. You don't know what they are, but they raise their rusting broadswords and with a wordless gesture they advance towards you. Roll 2d6. Holy fuck, I'm screwed here.
Russ,
watershed, Mark, watershed.
Russ particularly liked doing, because in Fabled Lands, I would say to him, you have to have fillers to stop the options pushing over the page. So I said, let's have lots of fillers, do whatever you like. It's just to give the feel of each book. And he particularly loved those because he could just go and do 16 little pictures that would be a shack beside a river or a rider at night on the crest of a hill with a message. And, he'd tell me the story behind it, but it didn't matter because they weren't supposed to be scenes that the player would see. They were just atmospheric. And he just used to love doing those. Each time when we'd start a book, those would be his favorite.
But they always reinforce the style. It's an echo of the bigger imagery. I wanted to ask Ian, how much did you get involved in briefing pictures? Did you come up with I've got 30 scenes and I need 30 pictures? How deep into your briefing did you go?
It depends which project. Quite heavily involved with Fiend Folio, obviously very involved with Warlock Firetop Mountain.
So talk us through Warlock. Were you giving him 3 pages of description, or was it just we need a couple of walks here?
We gave him not much more than a paragraph and let him do his own thing, because who are we to brief an artist in detail? But let them interpret what we write. And we were just completely amazed at how amazing those illustrations were.
A big part of the appeal, definitely.
Big part of the appeal, absolutely.
Yes.
Not always recognized as such, but certainly was in reality.
I think later on, I took over being the sort of assisting consulting editor on it. There were times when the artwork was a little more make weight. The times when it was lacking was often when the author didn't know what they wanted depicted and the artist didn't read their minds. When you had someone who was like, I want this, inspired by that last scene in Blade Runner, and I want this and this, and suddenly they really took life. So later on, the quality faded, but people like Russ were always, it's like, oh wow, the headliners come back now.
By the way, Marco, is that last scene in Blade Runner director's cut or last scene in Blade Runner?
Easy.
In all my own books, I've detailed every paragraph that I want illustrated. I didn't say to the editor at Penguin Books saying, you choose which ones you want edited and tell the artist accordingly. I wanted to be absolutely involved in illustrating what I thought were the most important paragraphs in the books.
So, and I know Russ was a regular, or came to a number of the Fighting Fantasy Fests, the semi-annual, is it annual or every 2 years?
Every 2 years.
Every 2 years event that Jonathan Green runs to celebrate not just Fighting Fantasy, but solo game books generally. A great meeting of the old clans. How involved was he in the later books? From which I lost touch.
Did he do any illustrations for the Revive series, the Scholastic series?
None at all. That's a whole program in itself, trying to convince Scholastic to use the original art. maybe I shouldn't get drawn into too much, but
well, it makes sense, in shorthand, if you're doing a whole new thing and relaunching, you want to refresh it, get new art in, spruce it all up. You can understand. However,
they wanted it to appeal to a younger audience. They were convinced that today's video games child would want something a bit more
anime
style, Photoshop, grayscale stuff. And we argued. I mean, we'd actually won the argument with Penguin originally to use our Games Workshop artists, that because when we said they were worried that being under the Puffin imprints that we couldn't use our artists. When we first discussed the art, they wanted a cover with a toadstool, little gnome sitting on top, milling around, a little frog sort of belching quietly in the background. And we said, no, we want a cover that threatens to rip the face off the readers.
Yeah, we want a skinned bloke on page 370.
Really terrifying illustrations inside. And to the great credit, Puffin and Penguin gave their thumbs up to our suggestion, and clearly it was validated because we convinced them that because of playing D&D for 7 years and knowing that audience, how exciting it was for kids' imaginations, it wasn't. And today's books, of course, sadly, the first, I can't remember when it was, they all look the same, so you can't tell really one character from another with the Scholastic editions. But the reason it happened is that they had a publishing date. They were insistent that they wanted to reimagine the series for today's audience, and there was this tight deadline, and this artist they found and was able to do it very quickly. I think he must have done 7 or 8 books in no time at all. So the detail went out the window for the sake of expediency.
We've only got a couple of minutes left. Oh, sorry.
We've got Scholastic back on track now, and we're all joined up in our thinking. So if you saw the latest one put out last year, Shadow of the Giants, we used Mike McCarthy, who's a Fable artist, and I think he's done an amazing job on both the cover and the internal art, and similarly with Steve's book.
Yeah, Carl Kopinski did the cover. Who did the insides of Salamonis, Secrets of Salamonis?
Kopinski didn't do the cover.
Oh, did he not?
No, the only one he's done is the hardback version of my book, Assassins of Valencia.
Oh, gotcha.
But if you don't know which is which, I'm going to give you a bit of a scoop ahead of Monday's announcement that we're doing a book of art around Fighting Fantasy.
That'll be
tell us more.
Yeah.
It's going to be published by Unbound, people who did Dice Men for me, and it's going to be out on their pledge site on Monday announcement. So there'll be a lot.
Fantastic, and how timely as well.
Yeah, so there'll be lots of Russ's artwork in that, of course, plus all the other iconic art from Fighting Fantasy over 40 odd years.
We'll share that with our Discord community and our patrons, because they will be all over that. I can guarantee it.
Then there's Scoop. It's called Magic Realms: The Art of Fighting Fantasy.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.
I'm co-writing it with Jonathan Green.
Yeah, what does he know?
What do historians know?
So, as I say, we've only got a couple of minutes left, and we have just one quick question from the chat. Maybe Dave Rosser asks if anyone knows, did Russ have a favourite creature to depict?
I know that his favourite picture was one of the Bloodsword. It's a creature that's coming around the side of a rock. And it's drawn its claws across the rock, and he's got great gouges that have come out, dripping acid or something. And he always said he thought that was his favourite monster that he'd drawn.
He always struck me as an artist who was looking for the next image rather than harking back to the ones he did. Although his pictures, show stylistic lines of inquiry and themes and so on.
Yeah,
he would surprise you again and again. He was looking for the next image, not the last one.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you so much to James, Dave, Ian, Marco for joining me this evening. It's been a real privilege and an honour to gather here to talk about Russ's work. Thank you for sharing both the pieces in IRL, in real life, and also the pieces that you shared with Andy and myself in advance, because that was amazing. A really, just a very small peek into a small part of Russ's work, but what an amazing artist he was.
Lindsay, can I just add one other thing? I nearly forgot. There's I've written an obituary of Russ that's in Casket of Fays, which is out tomorrow, and it's free to download from Drive-Thru. So Casket of Fays number 10, and there's more reminiscences and probably some more of his artwork people might not have seen. So
brilliant.
Well,
And russnicholson.blogspot.com
Yes.
remains live with all his art and all his thoughts about his creative process.
Brilliant.
And yeah, the ups and downs of working in this mad world we live in.
We'll share all those links. So once this goes out live on YouTube, but we will update the YouTube on demand with all of those links afterwards. So look out for that, and they're sitting in the comments. So I thank you again. Red Tree says thank you guys for sharing your wonderful memories. Russ had a big influence on me and so many others. Thank you all for sharing all your stories. A great tribute. Well, thank you, as I said, for joining me. Thank you to all our viewers. Please do remember to like, subscribe, share, do all of those things. And we will see you again soon for the next Inside the Rookery. Thank you so much. Good night.
Thank you, Russ.
Thank you, Russ.
Yeah, thank you, Russ.
Thanks, Russ.